The evening shift at Giovanni's had dragged on with a weary persistence that seemed to cling to the walls like the scent of garlic and simmered tomatoes. And as Rachel Monroe wiped down the last table by the window, her fingers throbbed with the dull ache of hours spent carrying heavy trays and forcing polite smiles at customers who rarely lifted their eyes from their plates. The small Italian restaurant, tucked into a worn corner of South Philadelphia, had nothing of elegance about it. Only checkered tablecloths, a haze of warm yellow lighting, and an aroma so deeply woven into her apron that no amount of washing could remove it. Yet it paid enough to keep her in a creaky one-bedroom apartment, enough to cover her mother's medication, and sometimes enough for a grocery trip that did not plunge her bank account below zero. And for Rachel, that alone was a blessing. She had been working at Giovanni's for nearly 4 months, ever since she had knocked on the door one desperate afternoon and told the manager she would do any job he had if he would only take her, and he had looked at her worn shoes and the unyielding determination in her eyes and nodded without another question. The job did not come with glamour, crisp uniforms, or generous tips, but it belonged to her, and in a city where people were swept up and discarded like trash, keeping steady work felt like a quiet victory. She glanced at the clock above the bar. 10:45. Only 15 more minutes until she could head home, kick off the shoes that were murdering her feet, and collapse onto her sagging spring mattress on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator. Each step across the dining room sent a sting through the soles of her feet as she carried the last tray of dirty dishes toward the kitchen. And Sal, the old Italian cook, who rarely spoke but always saved her a portion of spaghetti after every shift, gave her a small nod as she passed, and she returned it with a tired smile. The restaurant was nearly empty now. Only a couple sharing dessert in the corner, and an older man working through his 3rd glass of wine at the bar. The air had grown softer, and Rachel let her shoulders loosen, hoping the night would stay quiet, that perhaps for once she could walk home without looking over her shoulder, that perhaps tonight could be different. The front door flew open, and her heart lurched painfully. She recognized the sound of those footsteps before she even turned, the heavy, stumbling rhythm, the sharp scent of whiskey layered with something darker, the raw heat of unrestrained anger. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot as she forced herself to face the door. Ethan Cole stood there with his face flushed, his shirt rumpled, and his eyes wild with the fury she knew too well. His gaze swept the room like a predator hunting for movement, and when it landed on her, his mouth curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "So this is where you've been hiding," he slurred loudly enough that the couple in the corner snapped their heads up. "You think you can ignore me, block my number, pretend I don't exist?" Rachel's hands trembled as she set the tray down on the nearest table. Her thoughts scattered. It had been 4 months since she had left Ethan for good, after a year of emotional manipulation, blind jealousy, and nights spent wondering whether he would cross the line between shouting and hitting, and she had blocked his number, moved apartments, switched shifts, but somehow he had always found her. "Ethan, please," she whispered, trying to hold her voice steady. "I'm working. You need to leave." "Working?" He laughed, the sound bitter and sharp as he staggered forward. "You think I care? I'm here for my answers. You don't get to walk away like I'm nothing." Rachel inhaled slowly. She knew what was coming, and she was not sure she could escape it this time. If you are listening at this point, when darkness opens and a stranger steps out like a blade slicing through the fear choking Rachel, then you already feel that this story is only beginning. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video, so you never miss any of the emotional, gripping, heart-pounding stories we bring every day. And we would love to know where you are listening from. Leave a comment with the name of your city or country so we can see how far this story travels across the world and how many hearts it reaches alongside yours. Ethan stepped closer, the thud of his shoes echoing through the suffocating quiet. Rachel stood frozen, her entire body tense as he loomed over her, his dark eyes burning with that twisted emotion she knew by heart. He jabbed a finger toward her face, his voice rising until it drowned out the faint clatter of silverware. "You think you can disappear from my life? You think I don't know you work here? I gave you everything." Rachel backed up and struck the edge of a table, sending a glass crashing to the floor. Sal peeked out from the kitchen, his expression tight. The older man at the bar set down his wine, frowning. The couple in the corner stood, unsure whether to intervene. Rachel forced her shaky voice through her tightening throat. "Ethan, please. You're drunk. Leave before something happens." He let out a harsh laugh devoid of joy. "Something? What, you gonna call that old cook? Or your precious boss you've never even met? He took another step, shrinking the distance between them to mere feet. I'm the one you should fear. You owe me, Rachel. You don't throw me away like trash. We are over, she burst out, voice cracking but firm. I don't belong to you. You don't get to stand here and scream at me. His eyes darkened. You'll always belong to me, and now you're going to listen. He lunged and seized her arm, yanking her toward the door. Rachel cried out, fear clamping around her throat. Let me go. Sal shouted from the kitchen, but no one dared approach. Ethan dragged her through the tables, knocking into chairs and pulling a tablecloth to the floor as she fought against his grip. Her palm struck his arm, but he held tight, his breath thick with alcohol and rage. The door screeched open as he hauled her outside. The night air slapped cold against her skin, but the terror inside her was colder. The street was nearly empty, lit only by a wash of street lamps glowing on rain-slick pavement. Rachel twisted desperately, praying someone, anyone, would step in. We're talking right now, Ethan snarled, shoving her against the brick wall beside the restaurant. I'm not letting you run. You're all I have left. She tried to scream, but panic strangled the sound. His grip crushed her skin, leaving red marks. She could not break free. There was no one. No one would come. And then a voice rose from the darkness, low and cold as steel slicing clean through the chaos. Let her go. Everything stilled. Rachel stopped breathing. So did Ethan. They both turned toward the narrow alley beside the restaurant. A man stepped out, tall, with a long black coat brushing his knees. His face was half-shadowed, but his eyes gleamed with a chilling clarity, an authority that required no volume. The air itself seemed to hold still around him. Ethan, who moments ago had been a storm of rage, suddenly looked smaller, but he puffed out his chest anyway. Who the hell are you? This isn't your business. The man did not answer right away. He took another step forward, his voice even and sharp as a blade. Anything that happens in front of my restaurant is my business. Rachel froze. My restaurant. She had never seen him before, but the way he looked at Ethan was not the look of a passerby. It was the look of someone who held power, someone who did not need to shout to be obeyed. Ethan dropped her arm as if burned. He stumbled back a step, then another. I didn't mean anything. I wasn't. The man never moved his gaze. He flicked his eyes briefly toward Rachel, then back to Ethan. If I hear your name near hers again, what happens tonight will be the gentlest thing you ever experience. Ethan said nothing more. He turned and hurried off, his footsteps echoing down the wet sidewalk until they faded into the night. Rachel remained where she was, her hand trembling, her heart pounding erratically against her ribs. The man turned to her, his eyes softening just slightly. What's your name? Rachel, she whispered. He nodded once. Rachel works for me, and if anyone touches her again, tonight will seem merciful. He did not wait for her response. He turned and walked back into the alley, vanishing as though he had never been there at all. Rachel stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe. The sting in her wrist where Ethan had gripped her pulsed, but the terror had begun to ebb, replaced by something else. A stunned bewilderment mingled with an inexplicable gratitude. Who was he? And why had he appeared at the exact moment she needed someone? She did not know. Only that he had saved her. And the look in his eyes told her this would not be the last time she saw him. Rachel remained frozen on the damp sidewalk, standing in the place where everything had unfolded like a nightmare torn open by something she could not explain. She stared into the empty space where the mysterious man had vanished. The alley beside the restaurant now sunk into a silence so dark it felt as though he had never stood there at all. Yet she knew she was not imagining him. She could still feel every word he had spoken, every tight, painful beat of her heart when his eyes met hers, cold but never hollow, the gaze of a man who had witnessed too much suffering to be surprised by it anymore, yet still chose to step forward when someone needed protection. She rubbed her wrist gently where Ethan's grip had left red marks and quietly walked back inside. Sal was waiting behind the door, his eyes tight with worry, and though he asked nothing, he handed her a glass of water and gave a small nod as if to say it was over, but Rachel knew it was not. And more than anything, the man in the shadows, the one neither she nor Ethan had ever seen before, had altered the course of everything. That night, Rachel went home in silence. She did not turn on the music she usually played, did not turn on the lights when she stepped into her small apartment. She sat on the edge of her bed still wearing her uniform, her hands clasped together as the memory of his face replayed in her mind. She could not forget his eyes, could not forget his voice, low and steady yet weighted with authority. He had not needed to raise his fist or shout, and with only a few quiet words he had reduced Ethan to a trembling coward. The next morning, Rachel arrived at Giovanni's earlier than usual. She wanted to distract herself, wanted to clean, to prepare the dining room, to sweep away the residue of fear lodged in her chest. But as soon as she stepped inside, Tony, the older manager, was standing at the bar waiting for her. He crossed his arms and watched her for a long moment before he spoke. "Are you all right?" Rachel nodded, unwilling to relive the events of the night before. But Tony did not stop there. "I heard what happened. About Ethan. And the man who stepped out of the alley." Rachel tightened her grip on her bag, saying nothing. "Do you know who he is?" Tony asked, his voice dropping lower. She shook her head. "No, I've never seen him, but he said he owned this place." Tony exhaled heavily, as if bracing for that exact response. "Yes, you heard right. His name is Lucas Bennett." Rachel frowned. The name meant nothing to her. "He owns Giovanni's, but he has never shown himself. He does not like being seen," Tony replied, his gaze fixed firmly on her. "Lucas owns this building and at least 3 other restaurants around South Philly, but he is not just a businessman." Rachel felt her heartbeat quicken. "What do you mean? Who is he?" Tony stepped behind the counter, poured a cup of coffee, and only then answered. "People call him many things. Some say he is a kingpin. Some say he is just a reclusive tycoon. But there is one thing everyone agrees on. Lucas Bennett is not a man you want to cross. And last night, he put himself right in the middle of your situation." Rachel tightened her hold on the warm cup. His voice echoed in her mind again, short, precise. Let her go. She did not know why he had appeared at that exact moment, nor why he had known her name, but one thing she felt with a clarity that unsettled her deeply was that her life had stepped across a boundary the moment he spoke. And that man, he would return, not because of Ethan, but because of her. Rachel sat on the familiar wooden chair tucked into the corner of the restaurant's small kitchen, the cup of cold coffee resting in her hands, though she had not taken a single sip, every word Tony had spoken still echoing through her mind like an emergency broadcast that refused to fade. Lucas Bennett, that name, that face, those eyes, every detail was now sharper than it had been the night before, as if her memory was finally catching up with what her body had already understood. She still could not believe the man who had stepped out of the shadows was truly the owner of Giovanni's, the man who owned not only the restaurant but the entire building, perhaps even the whole block. But what chilled her was not the real estate or the money. It was the way Tony spoke about him, as if Lucas Bennett was not merely a person but a presence, something powerful, something people sensed before he ever made himself known. Tony leaned against the counter, his fingers wrapped around a steaming mug, his gaze moving over her with the calm deliberation of someone deciding how much truth a person could handle. "Lucas Bennett is not like anyone you have ever known, Rachel. He is not the type of man who walks into a room trying to make an impression. He does not have to. People feel him before he speaks." Rachel nodded slowly, remembering the way Lucas had looked at Ethan the night before. No threats, no raised hand, yet a single sentence had been enough to send Ethan stumbling away without a backward glance. "Is he Mafia?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with tension. Tony did not answer right away. He set his cup down, tapping a slow rhythm on the counter as if choosing each word with precision. "People call him a lot of things. Some say he used to work in finance. Some say he inherited a construction empire from his father. But there is one thing I know for certain. No one crosses Lucas Bennett, and no one survives it if they make him angry." Rachel swallowed hard, her chest tightening with an ache she could not name. "But why? Why would he help me?" Tony looked at her then, and for the first time that morning, his expression held a seriousness he did not bother to hide. "That is what I cannot figure out. Lucas does not step into other people's problems. He watches from a distance. He pulls strings from the dark. If he shows his face, it means he has already decided the situation matters. And last night, he decided you were someone worth protecting." Rachel turned away, not wanting Tony to see the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. For years she had learned never to expect rescue, never to wait for someone to stand between her and the storm. Every time Ethan shouted at her, every time she held her frail mother through the cold nights, she had swallowed her fear and told herself she could survive alone. Yet this time, at the moment when she had been closest to breaking, a stranger had stepped out of the night like a ghost, and pulled her back from the edge. She did not understand why. She did not know if he would ever appear again. But she knew with unwavering clarity that the look in his eyes had not belonged to a passerby. It belonged to someone who had made a choice, and that choice had been her. Tony reached into a drawer and placed a small piece of paper on the counter. One of Lucas's men dropped this off this morning, didn't explain anything, just said it was for you. Rachel picked up the paper, her hand trembling. The words, written in bold black ink, were few but heavy, every stroke as deliberate and forceful as the man who had written them. We need to talk, alone. Tonight, 2nd floor. There was no signature, no explanation, no address. But Rachel knew exactly who it was from, and she knew that if she refused, there might not be another chance. She lifted her eyes to Tony, and the older man gave her a slow, solemn nod. The 2nd floor is always locked. Only he uses it. The stairs are in the back. If you decide to go up there, make sure you are ready to hear things you will never forget. Rachel tightened her grip on the paper, a strange mixture of fear, curiosity, and something she had never felt before rising within her. She had never been the person chosen, but tonight, for the first time in her life, she would step into an entirely different world, a world with a name. Lucas Bennett. The staircase leading to the 2nd floor sat behind the old metal door near the kitchen, a place Rachel had always assumed was nothing more than storage or perhaps Tony's office, but tonight it led somewhere entirely different, into a world she had never imagined. Each step echoed through the empty hallway as if stretched out by the weight of what was waiting above, until she reached the large wooden door left slightly ajar. She knocked softly. There was no direct response, yet a low, steady voice from inside answered as though it had been expecting her. Come in. Rachel pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the air of the room swept over her with a quiet force that made her breath catch. This was not an ordinary office. The polished wooden floors, the wide oak desk, the towering bookshelves rising all the way to the ceiling, and the tall panes of glass overlooking the street where she had stood, trembling the night before, all gave the room an almost unreal stillness. The man seated behind the desk needed no introduction. Lucas Bennett wore a dark suit, the collar of his shirt undone by 2 buttons, the sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal strong wrists, and a silver steel watch with no visible brand. He lifted his head when she entered, his eyes dark as amber settling on her without hesitation, without searching, as though he had known her far longer than the moment they met. Sit. Rachel quietly pulled out a chair, feeling as though every movement she made carried weight. Lucas did not speak right away. He observed her as if reading a worn book with pages crossed out and rewritten too many times. At last he spoke, his voice deep and warm, needing no force to command complete attention. I owe you an explanation, and perhaps an opportunity. Rachel did not know how to respond, so she waited for him to continue. I make it a rule not to interfere in my employees' personal lives. But last night, when I saw him dragging you into the street, I knew I could not stay still. Not because of him, but because you did not call for help. You fought, even though you knew you would not win. Rachel bit her lip, something tight and aching rising in her throat. Lucas reached into a drawer, pulled out a thin folder, and slid it toward her. Inside were detailed ledgers, supplier contracts, invoices, payroll sheets, and a 6-month financial summary of Giovanni's. I need someone I can trust to handle this. Rachel looked up, stunned. You mean me? Lucas nodded. I have watched you since you started here. You arrive on time, you work hard, you keep to yourself, and most importantly, you never take advantage of anyone. You do not pretend to be innocent, you do not beg, and you do not try to be noticed. People like that, in my world, are rare. Rachel tightened her hands. I am just a waitress. Lucas gave a faint smile, his gaze unwavering. You are someone who understands the value of every dollar you earn. That is what matters to me. You will not deal with customers. You will not take orders. You will be up here, managing the books, overseeing the cash flow, reporting directly to me. A real job, with enough pay that you will never again have to wonder whether your mother can afford her medication. Rachel felt as if someone had reached into her chest and closed a hand around her heart. How could he possibly know about her mother? About the nights she counted coins in her wallet? Lucas seemed to sense the question. I do not monitor the personal lives of my employees, but when I let someone into my circle of trust, I need to know who they are, how they live, where they might be vulnerable. I did not protect you out of pity. I did it because I know you will not use it against me." Silence settled between them for a few long seconds before Rachel whispered, "Why me?" "Because I trust you." Lucas stood, walked around the desk, and placed his hand on the edge beside her. "You may refuse, but if you accept, everything will change. You will enter a world you have never seen, but in return, you will never have to fear anyone again." Rachel lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his in a still and wordless moment. She did not know what she was stepping into, but for the first time in years she felt she had a choice, and she no longer wanted to live in fear. She nodded. "I accept." Lucas did not smile, only inclined his head. "Then, we begin tomorrow." The office door closed behind Rachel with a blunt, heavy click that seemed to echo inside her mind all the way down the stairs. She slipped through the back hallway, past the half-cleaned kitchen, avoiding the questioning looks from Sal and Tony. Her hand still clutched the paper filled with the figures Lucas had given her, her palm damp with sweat, her heart still unsteady and racing. She felt as though she had signed something irreversible, even though she had spoken only 2 simple words, "I agree." But what did agreement mean? It meant stepping out of the world she knew, where every coin mattered. It meant becoming someone the elusive owner of Giovanni's trusted. It meant walking into the world of Lucas Bennett, where dim light and quiet words could make anyone retreat. Rachel did not sleep that night. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the groan of the heater and the distant hum of traffic drifting through the small window. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lucas's face, his gaze steady and ancient in its calm, the way he had placed an entirely new path before her, one she had never believed she deserved. The next morning she arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. Her steps slowed when she noticed the back door still slightly ajar, as if reminding her that the offer remained. But she walked straight into the kitchen, tied on her apron, and began her familiar tasks. She could not step through that door, not yet. For an entire week, Rachel said nothing to Tony, nothing about Lucas, nothing about the offer. She carried trays, wiped glasses, cleaned the kitchen after the evening shifts, moving through each day as though nothing had shifted, though inside her a silent war raged. Part of her wanted to run. She had lived so long on the edges of things, never expecting a seat at any table except the one where she served others. She had no training in finance, no degree, no business knowledge beyond remembering orders and regular customers. But the other part of her, the part that refused to stay invisible, the part that had stood upright while Ethan dragged her through the street, the part that had looked directly into Lucas's eyes and had not stepped back, grew stronger with every passing day. One night, after finishing her cleanup, Rachel did not go home. She stood alone in the kitchen, staring out the small window that opened into the alley where she had first heard Lucas's voice. Let her go. Only 3 words, but they had changed everything, and she finally understood. She was not afraid of Lucas. She was afraid of herself, afraid that if she accepted this opportunity, she would lose all the excuses that kept her life small and predictable. She would have to become someone new, someone who took responsibility, who stepped forward, who protected herself instead of waiting to be rescued. The next morning, Rachel knocked on Tony's door and asked for 3 days off to handle personal matters. She did not explain, only said she needed time to sort things out. Tony did not question her. He simply nodded, his eyes saying more than his words. During those 3 days, she went to the library, studied restaurant management, basic accounting, learned how to read payroll sheets and expense summaries. She took notes, underlined sections, held her pen the way someone with purpose would. On the 4th day, when she returned to Giovanni's, she did not put on her apron. She walked to the 2nd floor and did not knock. Lucas was already there, as though he had known this moment would come. He looked at her without surprise, only expectation. Rachel lifted her chin, standing tall, her voice steady. "I do not know if I will be good at it, but I will try." Lucas nodded once. "Good. Then we begin." Rachel's new work began with early mornings buried under stacks of documents and late nights spent with spreadsheets stretching across the screen, the glow of numbers lingering in her eyes long after she closed them. Lucas offered little instruction. He simply handed her what needed to be done and allowed her to find her own rhythm. There were no compliments, no reprimands, but whenever she finished something well, something subtle shifted in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. She gradually adapted to the pace of the work, to the way expenses were processed, to the particular system of coding invoices that only insiders understood. She discovered streams of income that never touched a bank, cash that appeared and vanished without a trace, transactions marked with symbols instead of numbers. She did not ask, and Lucas did not explain. She knew now that this was no ordinary restaurant. Giovanni's was only the visible surface. Behind it was a network far more intricate, one Lucas controlled through silence and iron discipline. And then Ethan returned. Not in person, not with shouting or bruising hands, but in a way far more insidious. He began texting former employees at Giovanni's, lurking near the building where Rachel lived, sending anonymous letters. Small actions, but enough for Rachel to understand that he was trying to re-enter her life through a different door. She told Lucas during a post-shift meeting, her voice steady but her hands trembling beneath the table. Lucas did not speak at first. He simply watched her for a long moment, then pulled out his phone, dialed a short sequence, and gave 2 crisp commands. Monitor every contact Ethan Cole makes. Tell me who he is meeting. 3 days later, Danny, the young technician Lucas trusted without reservation, stepped into the office with a tense expression. Rachel was reviewing the weekly expense sheets when she saw Danny place a folder on Lucas's desk. She did not intend to listen, but Danny spoke low, so quietly that Rachel found herself holding her breath. He is talking to the Rizzo Group. It was a name she had never heard before, but dread rose in her chest the moment Lucas's brow tightened. Rizzo was a name whispered with caution in the brief, muted conversations Tony had with longtime suppliers. A broken-off branch of an old northern crime syndicate, known for disappearances without evidence and jobs so filthy no one dared trace them. Lucas was silent for several seconds. Then he looked at Rachel. What does he want with them? Danny swallowed. He is offering information in exchange for protection. He told them there is someone inside Giovanni's they can use as leverage. Rachel went pale. She did not need anyone to explain what that meant. Her name, her position, the trust Lucas had placed in her, all of it, was now a bargaining chip in Ethan's hands. I do not know anything, she whispered, her voice tightening. I have not told anyone. I have never. Lucas lifted a hand, signaling her to stop. I know. If I thought you had betrayed me, you would not be sitting here. Some of the weight lifted from her chest, but something else in Lucas's eyes, something colder, more severe, made her spine tense. This is no longer about you and him. Rizzo wants an excuse to come after me, and Ethan just handed them one. Do you understand how serious this is? Rachel nodded, her fist tightening. I will not let them use me. I will not run again. Lucas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below where the lights washed over the old bricks worn by time. You do not have to run. But from this moment forward, every step you take will be watched. Not only by me, but by those trying to turn you into a weapon. Rachel stepped beside him, quiet for a moment. Then she said, I am not afraid of them, and I am not afraid of him. I am only afraid that if I stay silent, I will become the woman he once controlled. Lucas turned toward her, and for the first time, there was something like pride in his eyes. Then we will make sure he never has that chance, and when he shows himself, I will end this. Not because you are mine, but because he should never have touched something I have chosen to protect. The afternoon rain cast a dull gray veil over the entire block, each heavy drop tapping a steady rhythm against the second-floor windows of Giovanni's. Rachel sat before her computer, eyes fixed on the financial spreadsheets, though her mind drifted far from the numbers. In the past days, she had felt something lurking behind every movement she made, a shadow following the edges of her life. Fleeting glances that disappeared the moment she turned her head, a silhouette reflected in the car window as she left home, the phone ringing only to go silent when she answered. She knew Ethan had not stopped, and she knew the Rizzo Group was not the kind to abandon a potential advantage. Lucas had tightened security around the restaurant, yet he showed no sign of worry. He continued working in silence, the way a man accustomed to standing in the eye of a storm still held his glass without spilling a drop. That composure made Rachel even more aware of the danger closing in. That evening, after everyone had already left the restaurant, Rachel went downstairs to retrieve a file Tony had mistakenly sent to the wrong floor. Passing by the employee break room, she heard a faint whispering coming from inside, almost swallowed by the rain and the hum of the ventilation fan. She paused, pressing her ear to the door left slightly ajar. The first voice belonged to Frank, one of the delivery staff. He was on the phone, oblivious to anyone nearby. Yes, she is the only one going in and out of the second floor. No one monitors her. She always carries her laptop, her phone, the books. If you need it, I can get you a copy. Rachel froze. There was no mistake. They were talking about her. A brief silence followed. Then Frank continued. No, Lucas suspects nothing. He thinks she is loyal. But I know her type. Whoever pays more, she will follow. And I will be the one to help you get what you need. Rachel's heart pounded painfully. She stepped back, her foot brushing against a metal trash bin that let out a small clang. The whispering stopped instantly. She heard a chair scrape, hurried footsteps. Without thinking, Rachel bolted up the stairs, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She locked the office door behind her and leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. Frank. He had been working at Giovanni's long before she came. Quiet, polite, always lowering his head in greeting. And now he was selling her out, auctioning off her loyalty to people who could burn the entire building down in one night. She knew she had to say something. But to whom? And how? Lucas handled matters his own way. No police, no noise, only action. But if she told him, was she placing Frank directly into hands he would never escape from? She sat down, her thoughts spinning. But then she remembered the look in Lucas's eyes the day he said Ethan should never touch something he had chosen to protect. And she understood this was no longer just about her. If Frank was working with Rizzo, he wasn't only betraying her, he was carving a hole straight into the network Lucas fought to keep intact every single day. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number she had memorized without ever using. Lucas answered after only 2 rings, his voice low and steady as always. What happened? Rachel swallowed. I need to see you. Now. She hung up before he could respond, stood, and walked out of the office with a clarity she had never felt before. This time, she wasn't calling for help. She was ready to fight for the place she had earned, and if necessary, she would be the one to strike first. Lucas asked no further questions when Rachel stepped into the office that night, her face pale with worry, though her eyes held a steadiness that surprised even her. She recounted everything quickly and clearly, leaving nothing out from the tone of Frank's voice, to the words he spoke into the phone, to the way he glanced around when leaving the break room. Lucas sat still with his hands clasped, his head slightly tilted, as if listening to a complicated piece of music whose ending he already knew. When she finished, he remained silent for several seconds before giving a small nod. Good. So he has revealed himself. Rachel waited for anger, for a command, for anything sharp or explosive, but Lucas simply rose, walked to the locked filing cabinet, entered a code, and retrieved a thin folder. He placed it on the desk, opened it with deliberate calm, and turned the pages as though he had prepared for this long before the pieces fell into place. Frank is not the real target. He is only the lowest link. But if he is transmitting information, it means the Rizzo group is ready to step in. Rachel frowned. What are you planning to do? Lucas turned another page and pointed at a diagram showing the movement of unregistered cash between the restaurants he owned. Giovanni's is not the only place they are watching, but it is the one they believe is easiest to infiltrate because of you. They do not know they have chosen wrong. He looked at her now, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a command issued in the middle of a battlefield. We will give them what they want. Rachel stared at him. What do you mean? Lucas sat again, pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him, and began sketching with a blue ink pen. They want information. Then they will receive information, but the kind that forces them to come out. You will continue working as usual, but from now on, every document you handle will have a falsified copy, marked in a way that only we can detect. They will believe you leaked it. You will be the bait. Rachel froze, her heartbeat pounding hard in her chest. You want me to pretend to be the one leaking information? Lucas studied her for a long moment before answering softly. You do not need to do anything except what you have already been doing well. The rest will be handled by me and the team. We will embed trackers into the falsified files, encode the data so that it reveals itself only after it leaves our system. If Frank forwards anything, we will follow it to its final recipient. Rachel tightened her hands, her thoughts storming inside her. A part of her trembled, but another part, one she barely recognized, rose with a kind of fierce resolve. For the first time in her life, she was not running from the threat. She was stepping toward it. She nodded. I understand. But what if Frank becomes suspicious? Lucas's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Something sharper and colder. He will not suspect anything. He thinks you are easy to manipulate. The less you react, the more he will believe he is right. That is why you are the only one who can make this plan work. He paused, then added in a slower, heavier tone. But Rachel, once this begins, you cannot pull back. This is no longer about information. This is survival. Rachel did not blink. I know. And I am ready. Lucas looked at her, his eyes deep as the night sea. He did not thank her, did not offer encouragement, but the look alone told her he trusted her as he trusted himself. That night, as Rachel left Giovanni's, she knew she had crossed yet another threshold. She was no longer an employee, no longer a passive survivor. She was part of the strategy, a piece on the board. And this time, she would not allow anyone to overturn the game. That afternoon, the Philadelphia sky darkened earlier than usual. Thick, gray clouds gathering like a warning stretched across the horizon. Rachel stood before the mirror in the second-floor break room, fastening the last button of her charcoal shirt. Beneath the fabric, pressed against her skin, was a tiny recording device Danny had secured with medical tape. The audio would transmit directly to the temporary surveillance room Lucas had set up in the basement. She had rehearsed the conversation dozens of times in her mind, every question, every pause, even the small hesitations meant to appear natural. But now, with the moment closing in around her, every script she had memorized dissolved into fog. All she had left was the tight ache in her stomach and the shallow rise of her breath. Frank was the messenger. He had slipped a folded note into her desk drawer that morning. A single line scribbled in jagged black ink. The abandoned bus lot, 9 o'clock. Come alone. She had taken the note to Lucas immediately. He barely glanced at it before nodding. We let him think he is in control. But you will be the one running the game. At 10 minutes to 9, Rachel stood at the edge of the deserted lot behind the old industrial district. The weak streetlights cast thin halos that barely reached the oil-stained pavement littered with rust and trash. The cold wind scraped across the metal skeletons around her, carrying the musty scent of damp steel and the unmistakable smell of danger tightening in the air. She gripped her phone inside her pocket like a lifeline. In the distance, footsteps echoed. Ethan emerged from the shadows, a black jacket draped over his shoulders, his eyes catching the half-light with a predatory gleam. He looked thinner than the last time she'd seen him, but the arrogance remained untouched. Rachel kept her voice calm. "Why did you call me here?" Ethan smirked, his lips curling with the pleasure of a game he believed he already won. "Don't pretend, Rachel. I know what you're doing on the second floor. You think sitting next to Lucas makes you special? You're nothing. Just a piece he'll toss aside when he's done." Rachel did not respond. She needed him to talk, needed the words, needed the evidence. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her, cold enough to raise a chill along her bones. "I'm giving you a chance. Rizzo can protect you. They need someone on the inside, and I told them you were ready. Don't be stupid. You don't belong in Lucas's world. He's a killer, Rachel. He'll never let you live if you learn too much." Rachel felt her pulse hammering in her throat, though her face stayed still, empty. "And if I tell you I need time?" Ethan took another step, close enough for her to smell the old traces of cigarettes and liquor. His voice dropped, soft as syrup but wrapped around a threat. "If you pick the wrong side, Lucas will be the first to go, and you'll be next. You know what I'm capable of." He lifted a hand as if to touch her hair. Rachel stepped back, her eyes sharp as glass. "You will never lay a hand on me again. Ever." Ethan scoffed, then pulled a small piece of paper from his coat and tossed it at her feet. It was a printed screenshot of a financial sheet, flawlessly forged from the data Frank had stolen. But Rachel recognized every number, each one part of the trap Lucas had prepared. Ethan thought he was steering the moment. He had no idea he was already the one being hunted. She bent down, picked up the paper, and met his gaze without flinching. "All right, I'll think about it, but I'm not promising anything." He nodded, a flash of satisfaction crossing his face. "Good. I'll contact you again. And next time, don't come alone. Rizzo wants to meet you." He turned and walked into the darkness, unaware that every word he had spoken was already recorded, already delivered to the man he believed stood outside the game. Rachel remained still for a moment, her heart pounding, then turned and hurried out of the lot. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The match had begun, and this time, she was the spark. Ethan had no idea that the meeting that night had already marked the end of his story. The recording device had transmitted every word straight into the operations room, where Lucas and Danny sat in silence, listening to each threat, each name, each number as it was saved onto an encrypted drive. The next morning, Lucas did not confront anyone. He allowed everything to unfold exactly as predicted. Rachel continued her work as though nothing had happened. Frank continued to show up, still offering his stiff, uneasy smiles, his eyes betraying a secret he could no longer carry convincingly. but the trap was already closing. 3 days later, Frank vanished. No resignation, no text, no attempt to collect his pay. One of the drivers mentioned that his car had been boxed in on the highway by an unknown vehicle, and that no one had heard from him since. Rachel received the news while reviewing the end-of-month accounts, her fingers pausing mid-keystroke. Lucas entered the office at that moment, glanced at her, and said only one sentence: "We are reaching the end." That evening, Lucas handed her an envelope. Inside were a fake identification card and an encrypted phone. She would go to the designated location and meet Ethan one last time, not to pretend, but to finish it. The meeting room was inside an old, decaying hotel on the outskirts of town, a place once used for negotiations between rival groups before Lucas tightened his control over the area. Ethan was already waiting, suspicion clouding his expression when Rachel walked in alone. The arrogance was gone, replaced by jittery desperation. "Where is it? The proof? The files?" Rachel placed the USB on the table, forcing her hand not to tremble. He grabbed it immediately and plugged it into his laptop. The screen lit up with the fabricated folders designed to bait him. As he reviewed them, Rachel spoke, her voice surprisingly even. "Why are you doing this? Is it because of me? Or because you cannot stand the idea of someone living a life better than yours?" Ethan did not look up. "I lost everything because of you. You think I will let you stroll into a new life while I get tossed aside like garbage?" Rachel let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "I did not destroy you. You destroyed yourself. Every choice was yours." Ethan slammed his hand against the table, voice breaking into rage. "I did what I had to do to survive. You have no idea how the real world works, Rachel. Men like Lucas, like Rizzo, they control everything. I just wanted a piece of it. I just wanted to be respected. You will never understand that feeling." Rachel studied him, and for the first time, there was no fear, only pity. "You do not want respect. You want people to be afraid, and that is why you always lose." He shot up from his chair and moved toward her, but before he could speak, the door burst open. 2 men dressed in dark clothing stepped in, guns holstered at their sides, their expressions blank and cold. Ethan's face drained of color. He stumbled back, reaching for the laptop, but one of the men seized him by the arm. Lucas entered last, his hands in his pockets, his voice flat as stone. "Thank you for saying everything. We have all we need," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You have no right. I know the rules. I am not going anywhere without a warrant." Lucas did not respond. He simply nodded, and a second later Ethan was dragged out of the room, thrashing like an animal caught in its own trap. Rachel did not ask where they were taking him. She did not need to know. All she needed was the moment the door closed, because when it did, a part of her past closed with it. Ethan Cole disappeared from the city map that night. No one ever found him. No police report, no news story, no whispered rumor in the papers. And at Giovanni's, his name was never spoken again. Life settled back into quiet, but not the old quiet. This was a new kind of stillness, steadier, stronger, no longer shaped by fear. Rachel knew she had crossed a threshold she could never return from, but this time, she was not alone. And the past was no longer a threat. It was only a shadow that had finally been brought into the light. After that night, Rachel no longer looked at Lucas the same way. It was not fear, and it was not suspicion. It was the quiet realization that she had witnessed a part of him that had once been hidden beneath his steady gaze and the low, controlled calm of his voice. Ethan had vanished as if he had never existed. There was no body, no police report, no officers knocking on doors. No one at Giovanni's whispered or wondered where he had gone. His disappearance passed through her life like a cold wind, sweeping away a name that had stayed far too long. But Rachel remained, carrying the memory of the way Lucas had watched Ethan being taken away without so much as a blink, of the way he had ended everything without raising his voice or lifting a hand. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant early as usual. But this time she did not go upstairs. She waited at the entrance, standing still until Lucas appeared. He came alone, his long coat touched by the morning mist, his eyes holding the same unreadable chill. They looked at each other in silence for several seconds. Then Rachel spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I am not asking what you did. I am not asking where Ethan is. I just want to know if I am becoming like you." Lucas did not answer immediately. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and she followed. In his office, the early sunlight cut across the floor, stretching their shadows long and thin, like 2 parallel lines that would never meet. He sat, fingers interlaced, his eyes open and unguarded. He did not deny anything, he did not defend himself, and in that silence, she understood. She understood that to maintain a world like Giovanni's, a world where she could work, survive, and stand tall, Lucas had done things no one wished to do. He was the one who swept the darkness aside, the one who held the fragile balance with a cost that was painfully real, and she, somehow, had stepped into the center of that storm. But what kept her from breaking was not Lucas's strength, it was the fact that he had never forced her to witness the worst of what he did. He shielded her from the dirt of his world, even though she knew it existed. She drew a long breath, meeting his eyes directly. I do not forgive, but I am not leaving. I know I chose this path, and now I have to learn to face it, not run from it. Lucas looked at her, and in his gaze was something without a name. Not guilt, not pride, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had lived with loss long enough to stop explaining himself. He nodded once, offering no further words. For Rachel, that was enough. She rose, stepped out of the office, and returned to her ledgers, her numbers, the rhythm of a life that continued on. But from that day forward, in every glance exchanged between them, something had shifted. It was no longer the look between employer and employee, nor between a rescuer and the one protected. It was the recognition shared by two people who had seen the shadows in each other and still chose to stay. Not out of necessity, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, and perhaps a small measure of trust. The sudden Tuesday night downpour was not enough to cool the heavy, simmering heat that clung to Philadelphia in the last days of summer, nor was it enough to wash away the unrest gathering behind the walls of Giovanni's. For a full week after Ethan disappeared, the restaurant seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm. Yet Rachel could feel an undercurrent humming beneath everything, like a steel wire pulled so tight it needed only the slightest touch to snap. Lucas had grown busier than usual, meeting more people, speaking in languages she had never heard, and at times vanishing for an entire day without explanation. Tony tightened security, shifted schedules, and installed more cameras around the building, but Rachel knew all of it was just buying time. She knew the Rizzo group would not remain silent for long, and she was right. That night, after the shift had ended and most of the staff had gone home, Rachel stayed behind to double-check the expense report before sending it to Lucas. The rain still fell steadily, and the damp scent of old wood filled the air. She was bent over her spreadsheet when a strange sound drifted from the back of the kitchen. The rear door, which was always locked, now hung open just enough to let in a sliver of cold air. She stood, ready to investigate, when the sharp crash of shattering glass ripped through the empty dining room. A shadow streaked across the window, and then a chair flew through a pane, slamming into the bar. Rachel froze for only a heartbeat, but it was enough to understand exactly what was happening. They were here. No warnings, no threats, no theatrics. Only destruction, chaos, and revenge. She ran into the dining room and saw three men in hooded masks, each gripping a steel rod or a gasoline can. One was already splashing fuel across the curtains and tabletops. Another was smashing bottle after bottle of expensive wine behind the bar. The third stood near the door, acting as a lookout. The harsh reek of gasoline filled the room like smoke. Rachel shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the crashing bottles and the gravelly laughter of the intruders. One of them turned, recognizing her, and sneered, "Well, well, the little finance girl. Looks like tonight's your last night, sitting pretty in that air-conditioned office." Rachel stepped back, eyes darting for her phone, but it was nowhere in sight. She knew she could not outrun them. She also knew that if they burned this place down, everything Lucas had built, everything the team relied on, everything she had fought for would turn to ash, and she refused to let that happen. She grabbed a wooden door bar, gripping it so tightly her knuckles whitened, and stepped into the center of the room, her trembling hands at odds with the sharp steadiness in her eyes. "Stop. If you torch this place, you're not getting out either. The back door is locked, the front is blocked. No one survives in a room soaked in gasoline." The man with the lighter hesitated, his hand faltering. Rachel sensed the shift and stepped closer. She did not scream, did not beg. Her voice was clear, slicing through the thick air. "I know who sent you, but you came to the wrong person. Whatever you think you'll get here, you will not." A second later, the wail of an engine cut through the storm, headlights flooding the front of the restaurant in a blinding sweep. Lucas's team had arrived. Two dark SUVs screeched to a stop outside, and the intruders panicked instantly. The lookout bolted first but was tackled within seconds. Another raised his steel rod but was silenced by a single blow that dropped him flat. Rachel gasped for breath, her hand still wrapped around the wooden bar, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Lucas stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the wreckage. When his eyes found Rachel standing in the middle of shattered glass, soaked curtains, and the lingering fumes of gasoline, something in his expression shifted. No wounds, no tears. She was still standing, holding her ground like a guardian who refused to yield. And in that moment, he understood something with absolute clarity. She was no longer the woman he needed to protect. She had learned how to protect herself. After the attack, Giovanni's shut down for 3 full days to be repaired. The shattered windows were replaced, the gasoline stains and glass shards scrubbed from every corner, yet the heaviness in the air refused to fade completely. Rachel arrived early each morning, checking every light fixture, every delivery invoice, every lock, every hidden corner behind the kitchen. No one asked her to do this. She did it because the restaurant was no longer just a place to work. It had become a symbol of everything she had survived. And Lucas understood that. He did not appear immediately after that night. He did not ask if she was hurt, did not visit a hospital, did not knock on her apartment door the way any ordinary man might after the woman in his life narrowly escaped being burned alive. Instead, he stationed guards outside her building for 3 days, replaced the back door lock at the restaurant, and quietly reset the security system for the entire property. His care had never been something he expressed in words. It was only on the late afternoon of the 4th day that Lucas finally showed himself. She was standing behind the bar, noting down supplies that needed replacing, when she heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn immediately, but she knew it was him. There was a particular kind of silence that belonged only to Lucas, the kind that made a room seem to hold its breath when he entered. He walked up beside her, not too close, not touching but near enough that she could feel the change in the air. His gaze swept over the newly restored dining room, pausing for a few quiet seconds on the faint scorch mark still visible near the bar. Then he looked at her. "You did not run." Rachel lifted her head. "I am not someone who runs anymore." She thought he might offer gratitude or a warning, the way he usually did, but Lucas said nothing, and in that silence, something in his eyes softened in a way she had never seen. He took a seat across from her, fingers interlaced, and for the first time told her what had happened behind the scenes. He spoke of the Rizzo group, of backdoor agreements between factions, of why Giovanni's had been targeted not only because of her but because he had once refused a multi-million-dollar deal. His voice was low and steady as he spoke, stripped of intimidation or mystery. He was no longer the man who commanded rooms with a single glance. He was a man who had lived too long in the dark, allowing someone else close enough to see the scars time had carved into him. Rachel listened quietly, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking questions not out of curiosity, but because she wanted to understand him truly. When he finished, a long silence stretched between them. She met his eyes, without judgment and without fear. "I know you have done things I cannot even imagine, but I also see what you have protected, and I cannot turn away from that." A faint smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen that carried no caution, no mask. "You are not like anyone I have met. You do not ask why. You simply stay." Rachel blinked slowly, her voice steady when she answered. "I do not need you to be perfect. I just need you to be real." He nodded, rose to leave, then paused at the door. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something deeper, something that lingered. "Next time something like this happens, do not face it alone. Call me. I will come, wherever I am." Then he walked out, leaving behind just enough space for Rachel to understand she had stepped one step deeper into his world. No longer an outsider, no longer just the woman he protected, but the person he trusted, the first to see everything and still choose to stay. A light rain fell that night, the droplets tapping softly against the back awning of Giovanni's like a quiet, steady soundtrack to a conversation that had never existed before. Rachel sat on the old wooden bench behind the restaurant, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, while Lucas leaned against the railing, his gaze drifting toward the blurred glow of the city streets beyond. He was silent for a long time, so long that even the distant sound of a car horn faded away before he finally spoke, his voice low and muted like the night settling around them. "My father was the one who built the foundation of this organization, not to traffic weapons, not to grow rich on fear and spilled blood, but to create a safe place for immigrants no one else would protect." Rachel turned toward him, saying nothing, simply listening. Lucas continued, his voice steady, as though he were reciting a story buried too deep for too long. But ambition found its way in. Others pushed in. My father was weaker than they believed. There was an internal purge. He died before I turned 20. No one ever gave a clear reason. My mother died a year later from illness, though I know it was the kind of grief that kills faster than sickness. And from that moment on, I understood that if I did not step in, everything my father built would be twisted into a weapon for men far more ruthless than he ever intended. I did not choose this world, but I did not run from it either. I stayed, climbed, took control, then began scraping out every rotten piece inside the structure, cleansing not with the law, because the law protects no one on this side of the world, but with order, with rules, with limits, no drugs, no trafficking, no killing unless attacked first. Rachel tightened her grip around the warm cup, her eyes fixed on him. "You have never told anyone this," she said quietly. "Not Tony, not your guards, not the men who run your other branches, only me." "Why?" Lucas turned to her, and his eyes no longer carried that cold edge they held only the exhaustion of a man who had borne too much weight for too many years. "Because you are the only person who has never tried to change me, and you are not afraid when you see me exactly as I am. You do not ask who I want to become. You just listen, and somehow, that makes me want to tell you everything." Rachel said nothing. She simply stood, stepped closer, and rested her hand on his shoulder. In that moment, there was no Giovanni's, no deals, no shadows of the organization, no blood, no threats. There was only a man who had once been a boy losing his father, who had grown up holding grief like a second spine, who was now learning how to breathe again beneath the weight of his own history. And there was a woman choosing to stay not because she needed shelter, but because she understood that sometimes the only way to save someone is to sit beside them in silence and not leave. The meeting was set for a cloudy Monday morning at an abandoned warehouse in the southern end of the city, the kind of place where negotiations like this had ended more often in blood than in signatures. Lucas arrived on time, neither early nor late, and he did not bring many people with him. Only Tony and 2 trusted guards who stood behind him like shadows that never strayed. Rachel did not go with him, though she had asked. Lucas simply looked at her and shook his head, not because he doubted her strength, but because he refused to expose her to the world he had been shielding her from all this time. She understood, so she stayed behind, though her heart followed every step he took. Inside the old warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of rust and damp concrete, the corrugated steel roof groaning with every shift of wind, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Across from Lucas stood 3 men representing the Rizzo group, and the one in the center with graying hair and a cold, unblinking stare was Lorenzo Rizzo, cousin of the former boss and now the head after a long chain of internal purges. Lorenzo lifted his chin to look at Lucas, as if weighing the worth of the man before him, then spoke with a voice steeped in insinuation. "Long time, Giovanni. I thought you'd send someone else in your place." Lucas didn't raise an eyebrow. He simply replied with calm certainty. "If I sent someone else, none of you would dare sign." The comment made the 2 men behind Lorenzo shift, hands moving instinctively toward their belts, but Lorenzo raised a hand to stop them. He laughed, then a weary, poisonous sound. "So, what do you want?" Lucas placed a leather-bound file on the wooden table between them. Inside it, a list of neutral exchange points the 2 sides had once used to stay off police radar. Those sites would now be sealed and monitored jointly. A new camera system built by Lucas's team would be shared between them, and in return, the Rizzo group would withdraw all their men from Giovanni's and the surrounding blocks. No more deals, no more planted men, no more threats. Lucas said only one sentence. "You keep the East, I keep the West. No encroaching, no provocation. I do not want a war. But if you want one, I will be the one to end it." Lorenzo stared at him for a long time without speaking. Then he pushed the file toward the men beside him, and they flipped through the pages quickly, as though they had expected all of it. Finally, Lorenzo pulled out an old fountain pen, the kind reserved for ceremonial agreements, and signed. "You want to keep that girl, don't you?" he asked, without looking up. Lucas did not hesitate. "I will keep her at any cost." Lorenzo nodded, said nothing more, and stood, walking out of the warehouse until his silhouette dissolved into the pale morning haze. Lucas neither called after him nor watched him leave. He closed the file, slipped it into his leather case, and walked out with the quiet ease of a man returning from an ordinary meeting. But he knew this was the first bloodless pact signed between the two groups in more than a decade, and the only reason it existed was because he had chosen not to take revenge. He had chosen to keep Rachel safe another way. When Lucas returned to Giovanni's that afternoon, Rachel was standing on a stool, polishing the last row of glassware on the top shelf, the late sunlight slipping through her hair and making her look like something untouched by the darkness he had just come from. He said nothing, simply set the briefcase on the table and stepped closer, letting his hand brush gently against her back, the first touch in days filled with tension. She turned, met his eyes, and didn't need to ask. She knew he had done something no one expected. She knew he had chosen peace over retaliation. And in her gaze, Lucas realized he had not merely signed an agreement with the Rizzo group, he had signed a beginning for himself. A beginning that, for the first time in his life, carried not blood, but hope. That morning, when Rachel stepped into the second-floor office of Giovanni's, as she always did, she had no idea she was about to cross into an entirely new threshold. Everything looked the same. The dark wooden desk sat exactly where it always had, the cup of hot coffee beside the stack of paperwork still releasing its soft ribbon of steam. But next to the reports lay a pale brown envelope, her name written on it in a familiar, unmistakable hand. Rachel opened it slowly. Inside was an official transfer of ownership, stamped and notarized, bearing the title, Certificate of Transfer of Brand and Asset Ownership of Giovanni's, from Lucas Bennett to Rachel Monroe. Her hands trembled as she turned each page, but her eyes never left the signature at the bottom, the blunt, unwavering strokes of Lucas's handwriting. When she looked up, he was leaning casually against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, watching her not as an owner examining an employee, but as a man who had handed over a piece of his soul without regret. "I thought you would keep it forever," she whispered, her voice nearly catching. Lucas stepped inside, moving unhurriedly, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. "Giovanni's is no longer something I need to control," he said softly. "It needs someone who can breathe new life into it, someone who understands its worth from the inside, not just its ledgers or its recipes, its heart. And that someone is you." Rachel was silent for a long moment. She thought of the early days when she had walked into this place as a struggling waitress, fighting to earn enough to survive, fighting to hide her fear, fighting to believe she was worth anything at all. Now those memories felt like the foundation for the truth unfolding before her. Lucas didn't just trust her. He was entrusting her with a legacy, something she had never dared imagine for herself. "Why now?" she asked quietly. Lucas leaned back, eyes drifting to the window where morning sunlight glowed softly across the thin layer of dust on the glass. "Because I no longer need to control everything. I've created order, and you are part of that order. Not through force, not through fear, but through your steady presence in the middle of chaos. Giovanni's will go on, but not as a fortress, as a home, and I believe only you can make that happen." Rachel bowed her head, a swell of emotion rising in her chest, impossible to name. She had never wanted power. But now that it had been placed in her hands, not through struggle, but through trust, she felt responsibility more deeply than pride. "I will not let you down." Lucas smiled, a quiet, certain tilt of his lips, and nodded. "I know." Then he stood and left her sitting there in the room that still carried the imprint of both of them. When the door closed behind him, Rachel looked at the transfer papers again, not because she doubted them, but because she needed one more moment to absorb the truth. She was no longer a woman standing at the margins of Lucas's story, and Giovanni's was no longer the place she ran to for shelter. Now it was the place she would rise from, the opening chapter of her own journey, where she would not simply run a restaurant, but guard a past, a present, and a future built on trust. That night, Giovanni's closed earlier than usual. There were no murmurs of diners, no clinking of dishes coming from the kitchen, only the soft amber glow of the lights reflecting gently across the freshly polished glass panels. Rachel stood alone in the dining room, looking around the space that now bore her name on paper, yet still belonged to both of them in a way neither had ever dared to speak aloud. It took her no time at all to understand that what Lucas had given her was not merely a restaurant. It was an invitation, a recognition, a trust that did not need to be spoken twice. She turned toward the staircase and saw Lucas standing there, one shoulder resting against the wooden railing, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up, his gaze fixed on her as though it had been there for a very long time. There was no guardedness left in him, no cold veneer, only a man looking at her as though he had just found something he never believed he would deserve. "You did it," he said, his voice roughened by the weight of too much silence. Rachel walked toward him slowly, each step closing the distance that had once been filled with responsibilities, wounds, and unspoken obligations neither of them had asked for. She stopped before him and lifted her face. "I didn't do it alone. You laid the first stone for all of this." Lucas shook his head gently. "I built it out of fear of losing everything. You kept it alive with courage, a kind of courage I have never seen before." Rachel did not reply. Instead, she lifted a hand and brushed lightly against the top button of his shirt, as if needing to confirm that the man standing before her was real. Lucas didn't move, but his eyes faltered, softened. Rachel whispered, "I don't know when I stopped being afraid of you. Maybe it was when you didn't kill Ethan right away. Maybe it was the night you told me about your father in the rain. Or maybe it was when you fixed the camera behind the kitchen and didn't let anyone know." Lucas let out a quiet, weary laugh. "And I don't know when I started thinking of you before I made any decision. Maybe it was when you stood in front of those 3 men with the gasoline. Maybe it was when you never asked questions, but always understood." She looked at him for a long moment before speaking, without waiting for reassurance. "I don't want to be the person who walks behind you. I want to walk beside you. Wherever you go, however dark your past is, I won't leave, but I need to know if you choose that too." Lucas didn't answer with words. He stepped toward her, closing the last uncertain space between them. He lifted a hand to her cheek, his fingers cool, yet tender enough to make her eyes fall shut. When she opened them again, he was closer, his voice a hush that carried the weight of truth. "I don't choose this because I need someone to save me. I choose it because for the first time, I believe I can be loved without hiding who I am." She didn't answer with words either. Rachel slid her arms around his neck, drew him down to her, and the kiss they shared held no urgency, no frantic hunger, only acknowledgement, acceptance, whole and without condition. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them needed to say anything more. Night had settled fully around them. No strangers remained, no disguises. They chose each other, as quietly and simply as a warm light being switched on in a room that had been waiting for it all along. 1 year later, on the very day Giovanni's reopened after its full restoration, the spring sunlight washed over the restaurant's facade like a quiet blessing from a city that had never been kind to those who refused to bow. That morning, Rachel stood at the entrance with the new brushed brass sign gleaming above her, the name Giovanni's. Since 1978, now carrying a small line beneath it. "Under new soul, same heart." A line wound down the block, full of familiar faces returning, and newcomers drawn by the stories whispered across the neighborhood about the legendary lasagna and the young woman who had transformed what was once a symbol of underground power into a cultural gathering, place for the community. Inside, the interior kept the bones of its past, renewing only what had grown weary. The white lace-trimmed curtains, the low-hanging chandeliers, and the dark walnut bar counter remained, but the menu now included plant-based dishes. A reading nook near the front window offered free books for children, and every Saturday night was now an acoustic open mic for street performers. Rachel had not simply restored the restaurant. She had reimagined the soul of it. She expanded the staff by hiring from youth rehabilitation programs, offered full wages, proper insurance, and hosted monthly financial literacy workshops. No one came to work there merely for a job. They came because they were respected, because they were given a chance to begin again. Lucas arrived late on reopening day, blending into the crowd like a guest rather than a founder. He dressed simply, watching everything with an observant gaze that missed nothing, though this time it no longer carried the tension it once held. It held instead the quiet expression of a man who had learned how to let go of what needed to be placed in the hands of someone worthy. When his eyes found Rachel at the far end of the bar, she was signing an invoice for a new local supplier, smiling with the ease of someone who no longer needed to prove herself. And in that moment, Lucas understood she truly belonged here. A local reporter stopped by in the afternoon, took a few photos, and asked her about the journey from a server who had once been dragged out of this very place by a man from her past to the woman now leading a brand with deep roots in the city's memory. Rachel only smiled softly. "No one succeeds alone. I am simply someone who dared to believe when others believed in me." Later, the elderly owner of the corner convenience store sent over a small bouquet with a handwritten note in a shaky but determined script. "Thank you for making this neighborhood worth living in again." And indeed, that was what Rachel had done. Without titles or badges, she had become a leader not because she claimed the role, but because others looked at her and saw a path forward. Giovanni's had become more than a restaurant. It was now a haven of hope, of renewal, of stories once shattered but never buried. And Rachel, standing at the center of it all, embodied something many had stopped believing could exist: kindness that manages to thrive even in places once swallowed by shadow. As the sun dipped westward, the tiny bell above the door chimed for the 100th time that day. Rachel turned, her smile still warm, her hand lifting to her chest as if to remind herself that this place, this moment, all of it was real. Giovanni's had been reborn, and this time, it carried a heart that beat in rhythm with the entire community. That evening, after the restaurant had closed and the staff had all gone home, the lights inside Giovanni's were reduced to a few soft glows, just enough to catch the dust floating in the quiet air. Rachel sat at the last table in the corner, the place where she often worked late, her hand moving lightly across the final page of next month's planning notebook. The familiar sound of footsteps behind her made it unnecessary to turn. She already knew who was approaching. Lucas pulled out the chair across from her, set a cup of coffee in front of her, and placed an open bottle of wine on the table. No ceremony, no declarations, just two people who had walked far enough together to understand that the most lasting agreements begin with comfortable silence. She looked at him, her eyes tired from the long day yet steady with resolve. "I turned down an investment proposal today, from a large restaurant chain over in Jersey. They wanted to buy the Giovanni's brand to expand it." Lucas didn't react with surprise. He simply lifted his glass and took a small sip. "You did the right thing, because if you let them take this name, they would kill the soul you just rebuilt." Rachel nodded, her fingers absent-mindedly rolling the pen on the table. "I thought about that the entire morning. Then I remembered the first time I wiped a table here. No one knew my name, no one cared about my voice, but I kept going, because I felt there was something different about this place. And now I understand. That difference comes from people willing to walk together even when none of them knows what lies ahead." Lucas went quiet for a few seconds. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small stack of papers, the expansion plan for turning Giovanni's into a community-based model, an idea they had debated for hours, months ago, but had never fully shaped. Now it had a clear roadmap, detailed diagrams, and a full risk analysis. He slid it toward her, his eyes no longer carrying the coldness of the past, but a deep, steady trust. "If you still want to do this, we'll do it together. Not you doing it while I support, but the two of us moving forward side by side, each carrying a share of the responsibility, a share of the vision." Rachel looked down at the papers, then back up at him. "I never thought there would come a day when I could plan long-term with someone, and certainly not that the someone would be you." Lucas smiled, not the guarded or half-formed smile she used to know, but something far gentler, as if he too had been waiting a long time for this moment. "I used to believe that to survive in my world, I couldn't have anyone walking beside me, but you didn't just walk beside me. You stepped in, saw everything, and still chose to stay. And that makes me believe that some things don't need to be fought for to be kept. Sometimes you just open the door, and the right person won't leave." They clinked their glasses, needing no promises spoken aloud. Every commitment between them lived not on paper, but in the days they had already crossed together, in the disagreements they had endured without ever stepping away. Rachel looked at Lucas and no longer saw the image of a man who had once held power over life and death in the shadows. She saw instead someone who knew when to put the blade down and when to take a hand. And within herself, she no longer saw the woman who had once panicked in a dark alley, but someone strong enough to stand beside this man without bowing, without fear. They were partners, in work, in life. And no matter how many turns the road ahead might take, one truth had never been clearer: neither of them would walk it alone again. That afternoon, after finishing a meeting with the community development team about a non-profit franchising model for Giovanni's, Rachel asked Lucas to pull over at a small alleyway in South Philadelphia. Autumn had arrived, leaves drifting gently across the quiet pavement, the air carrying a mild chill that seemed to slow the world down. Lucas didn't ask why. He knew this place. It was the very alley where, 1 year earlier, Rachel had been dragged away by Ethan beneath the indifferent eyes of strangers, a place where the shadows of her past had once threatened to swallow her whole. Rachel walked slowly toward the corner of the wall where the old crack in the brick still remained, the spot where she had once felt completely alone. She stood there for a long moment, looking into that invisible space where she had once been cornered. But now there was no fear, no anger, only the quiet steadiness of someone who had made it through. Lucas stepped behind her, keeping just enough distance to let her feel his presence without taking away the space that belonged to her alone. Rachel turned to him, her gaze soft, as if she had finally reclaimed the missing piece within herself. "Do you remember," she asked, "the first time you said 3 words to Ethan?" Lucas nodded slightly. "Let her go," she smiled. "I don't think you were only talking to him. I think that was the first moment in my life when someone told me I had the right to walk away from something awful, to be free, to let go. And today, standing here, I know I truly have." Lucas held her eyes for a long moment before slowly extending his hand, not a command, not an attempt to claim, just an invitation. Rachel placed her hand in his, warm and steady. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The alley was no longer a dark memory. It had simply become a place that had witnessed her rebirth. My dear friend, Rachel and Lucas's story may have begun in pain, in moments that felt too heavy to survive. But their journey shows us something powerful. When even one person chooses to stay, to believe, to not turn away, every wound can find its way to healing. This story isn't only about love or power. It is about forgiveness, about rising above the past to write a future of your own making. It is about learning to release what once broke you and finding the courage to stand up again, stronger than before. If you have ever felt like Rachel, lost in life, unsure if anyone was truly on your side, believe this. There will always be a Lucas in your world, not someone who appears to rescue you, but someone who reminds you that you deserve to keep moving forward. And sometimes, without knowing it, you may be that person for someone else. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of a memory, a person, or a turning point in your own life? I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly value hearing from your heart. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue traveling together through more emotional journeys ahead. Every day, we do our best to bring you stories that resonate deeply, carry real human meaning, and remain accessible to every viewer. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until the end of the video, wishing you good health, a peaceful spirit, and a life filled with love every single day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.